They took a chainsaw to 150 years of history while I was away at my swearing-in ceremony. By the time I arrived home that evening, all that remained of my grandfather's hand-built barn was a pile of splintered wood and broken memories. The Evergreen Estates HOA had finally done what they'd been threatening for months, and they had no idea they'd just declared war on the district's newest federal judge. Some people think power should be wielded like a sledgehammer. I prefer the precision of a scalpel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never wanted to be that guy who lets a title go to his head. When I received the appointment to the federal bench 3 months ago, I promised myself I'd remain the same Mike Donovan who grew up climbing trees and fishing in Pinecrest Valley. The same Mike whose grandfather taught him the value of honest work and standing your ground. That promise became a lot harder to keep when I drove down the gravel path to my family property and found Harold Donovan's legacy reduced to rubble. The Evergreen Estates HOA had been eyeing my grandfather's land ever since developers transformed the neighboring farm into their luxury community 15 years ago. My 5 acres sat like an island of authenticity in a sea of cookie-cutter mansions and manicured lawns. The historic barn, built by my great-great-grandfather in 1873, stood as a monument to our family's connection to this land. Weathered wood telling stories that their vinyl siding and granite countertops never could. When I inherited the property, after Grandpa Harold passed last year, the HOA's letters started arriving almost immediately. First, they were thinly disguised as community updates. Then came the complaints about aesthetic inconsistency. Finally, they escalated to demands citing obscure county regulations and property value concerns. Each letter bore the same looping signature: Karen Westfield, HOA President. I kept every letter, responded to every citation, and attended their monthly meetings to explain that my property predated their development by over a century and wasn't subject to their jurisdiction. I even invited historical preservation experts to document the barn's significance. For a while, it seemed like they were listening. The letters stopped coming. I thought I'd made my case. That's why I felt comfortable leaving for 3 days, to attend my swearing-in ceremony in the state capitol. What I didn't know was that Karen and her board had simply been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. My childhood friend, James Fletcher, called me just as the ceremony ended. His construction company had been hired by the HOA for an emergency demolition after they'd supposedly obtained an urgent structural hazard order. When James realized whose property they were targeting, he tried to stop it, but by then 3 other contractors were already tearing into the barn with chainsaws and a bulldozer. They had papers, Mike, James said, his voice cracking. Official-looking documents with county letterhead. I tried calling you, but the ceremony. I remember standing there in my new judicial robes, phone pressed to my ear as the life I'd known collapsed along with those ancient wooden beams. Something inside me hardened in that moment. Not rage exactly, but a cold, calculated resolve. They thought they'd won by destroying something irreplaceable. They had no idea they'd just sparked something far more dangerous. My determination to see justice done. The scene that greeted me when I arrived home still haunts me. Splinters of hand-hewn oak beams scattered across the grass. The weather vane my grandfather had lovingly restored, now twisted and broken. The antique farm equipment he'd preserved, now crushed beneath debris. And standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed with a look of smug satisfaction, was Karen Westfield herself. She wore her power-like costume jewelry, gaudy and obvious. Designer sunglasses perched on her highlighted blonde hair, luxury SUV idling behind her. Karen approached with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Judge Donovan, congratulations on your appointment," she said, extending a manicured hand I didn't take. Such unfortunate timing with this safety situation, but now you can build something that truly enhances our community's value. Her smile never wavered as she handed me a folder containing the supposed emergency order, along with architectural guidelines for what I would be permitted to build as a replacement, as if my family's heritage was nothing more than an eyesore to be corrected, as if she was doing me a favor. The demolition costs have already been covered by the association, she continued, though we will need to discuss the landscaping fees. The board feels that since this benefits your property value substantially, a 50-50 split would be fair. I said nothing, just stared at her with the same measured gaze I'd practiced in my first courtroom years ago. The silence stretched until her smile began to falter. We had no choice, she finally said, defensive now. The structure was declared hazardous. We have a duty to protect community aesthetics and safety. I finally spoke, my voice quieter than she expected. I'd like you to leave my property now, Ms. Westfield. She blinked, unused to being dismissed. We should really discuss the next steps. We'll discuss everything in due time, I said. Right now, I'm asking you to leave. Something in a tone must have warned her. She retreated to her SUV, calling over her shoulder about scheduling a proper meeting soon. I watched her drive away, tires kicking up dust on the same path where my grandfather's tractor had once rolled. That night, I sat among the ruins with a bottle of Grandpa Harold's favorite whiskey and examined the documents. It didn't take my legal training to spot the inconsistencies. The county order had been issued by a department that didn't exist. The signatures didn't match any officials currently serving. Most damning of all, they dated the inspection 3 days earlier, when I'd personally checked the barn's condition before leaving town. Morning found me clear-headed and focused. I called the actual county inspector to document the fraudulent paperwork, then contacted the Historical Society to record the destruction of a potential historical landmark. By noon, I had confirmation that no legitimate safety order had ever been issued. By evening, I'd filed a police report for destruction of property and potential forgery of official documents. But I knew how these battles typically played out. The HOA had deep pockets and connections throughout the local government. They'd drag out any conventional fight until I ran out of energy or resources. Karen Westfield had likely done this before to other residents who wouldn't or couldn't fight back. She expected a settlement, maybe an insurance claim, and ultimately, my compliance with their vision. She didn't expect me to understand the system better than she did. She had no idea who she was really dealing with. I called Linda Chen, a former client who now sat on the city council. Linda, remember that conversation we had about predatory development practices? I think I've found you a perfect test case. The following Monday, I appeared at the Evergreen Estates monthly board meeting. Karen's expression flickered with annoyance. When she saw me enter the community clubhouse, I took a seat in the back, listening as they discussed lawn height restrictions and approved a new shade of beige for exterior paint. When the meeting opened for resident comments, I approached the podium. My name is Michael Donovan, I began, my judicial robes left at home, but my courtroom voice in full effect. Last week, while I was being sworn in as a federal judge, your board authorized the illegal demolition of a historic structure on my property based on fraudulent documentation. Murmurs rippled through the audience of homeowners. Karen tried to interrupt, but I continued. I'm not here to threaten legal action, though that will certainly come. I'm here to make you an offer. I set a folder on the podium. Inside is a proposal for rebuilding the barn as a community historical center, funded primarily through preservation grants that I've already begun securing. The structure would be restored to its original specifications, with educational facilities added to showcase our region's agricultural heritage. I looked directly at Karen, whose face had gone rigid. Your association has a choice. You can partner with me on this project, publicly acknowledge the error in demolishing the barn without proper authority, and help create something valuable for the entire community. Or you can oppose me, in which case I'll be forced to pursue all available remedies, both civil and criminal. The room fell silent. Board members exchanged nervous glances. Karen's face had turned an interesting shade of crimson. "You can't just come in here and threaten us," she finally sputtered. "This is a private association with bylaws and procedures." "Yes," I agreed, "and I've read them all. Particularly interesting is Section 17 regarding fraudulent actions taken in the association's name. Would you like me to elaborate on the criminal penalties for forging county documents?" An older board member leaned forward. "Perhaps we should discuss this proposal in more detail, Ms. Westfield." Karen's knuckles whitened around her gavel. "We'll take it under advisement," she said through clenched teeth. "The board will need to consult our attorneys." I smiled. "Of course. Due diligence is important. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I've already taken the liberty of forwarding all relevant materials to the County Prosecutor's Office and the State Attorney General's Division on Homeowner Association Regulations. They're quite interested in discussing this with you as well." As I walked out, I could feel the shift in the room. The whispered conversations, the sideways glances at Karen, the realization among homeowners that they might be legally exposed for actions taken by their board. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Back home, sitting on my porch overlooking the empty space where the barn had stood, I made a series of phone calls. First to James Fletcher to commission architectural plans for the barn's restoration. Then to several homeowners I'd identified as being previously strong-armed by the HOA. Finally, to a journalist at the regional paper who specialized in local government accountability. Karen's first countermove came the next morning, a cease and desist letter from the HOA's law firm, demanding I stop making defamatory statements about the association. I added it to my growing file. By afternoon, she'd escalated to having 2 board members park outside my property, photographing alleged code violations. I waved and took pictures of them in return. They left within the hour. 3 days later, the first newspaper article appeared. Historic barn demolished. While judge at swearing in, HOA actions questioned. The piece detailed the suspicious timing, the questionable documentation, and included statements from county officials confirming no legitimate safety order had been issued. It also revealed a pattern of similar aggressive actions against other properties bordering the HOA's territory. The community reaction was swift. My phone began ringing with calls from neighbors I'd never met, each with their own story about the Evergreen Estates HOA's intimidation tactics. The Historical Society organized a protest at the next city council meeting. Linda Chen proposed an emergency ordinance requiring county verification before any structure over 50 years old could be demolished. Karen tried to regain control of the narrative. She scheduled an emergency HOA meeting, circulated a letter claiming I was using my position to bully the association, and even attempted to recruit supporters by suggesting property values would plummet if the barn was rebuilt. But her efforts fell flat as more residents began questioning how their dues were being spent and who had authorized the demolition. I didn't need to attend that emergency meeting. James Fletcher was there and called me afterward. "She's losing." "Them, Mike," he said. "When she couldn't produce the actual safety inspection documents, people started walking out. 3 board members have already resigned." A week later, Karen arrived at my property unannounced. The polished confidence was gone, replaced by a desperate determination. "What will it take to end this?" she demanded. "Name your price." I was replanting my grandfather's heirloom vegetable garden near where the barn had stood. I didn't stop working the soil as I answered. This isn't about money, Ms. Westfield. It's about accountability. Fine. The association will issue a public apology and cover the full cost of rebuilding your barn. She said the word like it tasted bitter. I looked up at her. That's a start. But this is bigger than my property now. This is about ensuring your HOA never does this to anyone else. What exactly do you want? Her voice had lost its commanding edge. I stood up, brushing soil from my hands. Complete transparency in all HOA operations, financial audits for the past 5 years, new elections under county supervision, written acknowledgement of properties like mine that are exempt from your jurisdiction, and your resignation. She laughed, though there was no humor in it. You're asking for everything. That's not a negotiation. I'm not negotiating, I said simply. I'm telling you how this ends with the least damage to everyone involved. The alternative is a very public legal battle that will expose every corner of your association's practices. Given what I've already discovered, I don't think that's an outcome you want. Karen's facade finally cracked. You have no idea the work I've put into this community, the sacrifices I've made to protect our investments. These properties are all some people have. That's exactly my point, I said. My grandfather's barn was all I had left of him. You didn't see its value because it didn't fit your vision. Now you're facing the consequences. She left without another word, tires squealing on her way out. 3 days later, the HOA's attorney contacted me to discuss settlement terms. The resolution came more quickly than I expected. Karen resigned the following week, citing personal reasons. The remaining board members, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, accepted all my conditions. The historical barn project received unanimous approval from both the HOA and the City Council, with James Fletcher's company hired to lead the reconstruction, using as much of the original materials as could be salvaged. Most satisfying was the letter that arrived in each Evergreen Estates resident's mailbox, a formal apology for the unauthorized actions taken by previous leadership, along with a new transparency policy and recognition of historical property exemptions. An independent audit revealed years of questionable financial decisions, leading to a complete restructuring of how the association operated. 6 months later, I stood watching as the framework of the barn rose once again on my property. The new structure followed the original plans, but included space for community historical exhibits and educational programs. Several of my former HOA adversaries had even volunteered to help with the rebuilding, eager to be part of something that honored our shared heritage rather than erased it. Linda Chen joined me, surveying the progress. You know, you could have destroyed them completely, she said. With what we found in those audits, you could have disbanded the HOA entirely. I shook my head. That was never the goal. Organizations like that serve a purpose when they're run properly. The problem wasn't the HOA itself, it was the abuse of power. She nodded toward the construction. Your grandfather would be proud, not just of rebuilding, but of how you handled everything. As workers raised another reclaimed beam into place, I thought about Grandpa Harold and the lessons he taught me, about patience and persistence, about standing your ground without becoming the very thing you're fighting against, about the difference between revenge and justice. I spotted Karen Westfield's former house in the distance, a for sale sign swaying in the breeze. I'd heard she'd moved to a condo in the city, unable to face the community after the full story emerged. Part of me felt sympathy for her despite everything. She'd believed she was protecting something valuable, just as I had. The difference was that I'd found a way to create something better from the destruction, something that served more than just my own interests. The new barn would stand as a monument not just to my family's history, but to the idea that justice doesn't always mean winning at all costs. Sometimes it means rebuilding something stronger than what was lost. Sometimes it means using power not as a weapon, but as a tool to restore balance. And every day when I put on my judicial robes, I carry that lesson with me. Because in the end, true justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. It's about making things right, even when they can never be the same again. That evening, as sunset painted the new barn in shades of gold, I raised a glass of my grandfather's whiskey and a silent toast. To Harold Donovan, whose values had guided me through this fight. To the community that had ultimately chosen to preserve history rather than erase it. And to the power of patience, which accomplishes what force never could. Some battles are won in an instant. The most important ones take time, precision, and the wisdom to know when victory isn't about defeating your enemy. It's about transforming them into allies. The community response exceeded anything I could have imagined. What began as my personal battle transformed into a movement for accountability that rippled far beyond Pinecrest Valley. News outlets from neighboring counties started calling. Legal blogs published analyses of the case. Even a state senator contacted me about strengthening historic preservation laws. But with public attention came unexpected complications. Anonymous threats started appearing in my mailbox. My car was keyed in the courthouse parking lot. Someone spray-painted "traitor" on my mailbox after I granted an interview to the regional news. The message was clear. I had disrupted a power structure that extended beyond just Karen and her board. I discovered through Linda Chen that Evergreen Estates wasn't just any development. The investment group behind it had similar communities. In 3 counties, all operating with the same aggressive expansion tactics, Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a well-compensated agent for developers who had perfected the art of absorbing adjacent properties through intimidation and selective enforcement. The breakthrough came when a former board member contacted me, conscience weighing heavy after seeing the newspaper coverage. He arrived at my home after dark, nervously glancing over his shoulder before handing me a flash drive. "They keep 2 sets of financial records," he whispered. "One for the residents, one for the real investors. I was told it was standard practice, but after what they did to your property..." He shook his head. "This goes higher than Karen, much higher." The files revealed a sophisticated operation. The HOA had been systematically targeting properties along their borders, creating artificial code violations, then using the resulting fines and legal pressure to force sales at below-market rates. The land was then rezoned and folded into new development phases, yielding millions in profit. My grandfather's property, with its commanding views and road frontage, had been on their acquisition list for years. Armed with this evidence, I faced a crucial decision. I could take everything to the authorities immediately, triggering investigations that would certainly make headlines. Or I could be more strategic, using my position within the system to ensure this predatory pattern couldn't simply relocate and rebrand elsewhere. I chose the latter. First, I quietly briefed select officials in the State Attorney General's office, providing copies of all documentation. Then I worked with Linda to draft county ordinance changes that would require extraordinary transparency for all HOA financial transactions and board decisions. While those wheels turned slowly, I continued the public battle over my grandfather's barn, keeping their attention focused on what they perceived as a manageable problem. The developers behind Evergreen Estates sent their attorneys to offer an extraordinary settlement, twice the property's value plus rebuilding costs if I would drop the matter entirely. When I declined, the offer doubled, accompanied by thinly veiled references to my judicial career prospects. Their desperation confirmed I was on the right track. Karen resurfaced at a town hall meeting about the proposed transparency ordinances. She'd lost her polished veneer, interrupting speakers and making caustic remarks until she was finally recognized. This witch hunt against homeowners associations is nothing but revenge politics, she declared, pointing directly at me. Judge Donovan is abusing his position to settle a personal score over an eyesore that needed to come down anyway. His grandfather's barn was a hazard and an embarrassment to our community. The room fell silent. I didn't need to respond. The community did it for me. One by one, residents stood to recount their own experiences with the HOA's tactics. A retired couple forced to repaint their home 3 times in a year. A disabled veteran fined for a wheelchair ramp that was architecturally inconsistent. A young family pressured to sell after installing a therapy swing for their autistic child. Karen left before the meeting concluded, but the damage was done. The ordinances passed unanimously the following week. 2 days later, state investigators arrived at the Evergreen Estates offices with subpoenas for their complete financial records. The developer's stock price dropped 15% on the news. The final confrontation came not in a courtroom, but at the groundbreaking ceremony for the rebuilt barn. We had designed it as a community historical center, incorporating salvaged materials from the original structure. Nearly half the town turned out, along with preservationists and media. I was preparing to address the crowd when I noticed Karen standing at the edge of the property, watching. I walked over to her, away from the microphones and cameras. "I didn't expect to see you here," I said. She looked thinner, tired. "I wanted to see what all this fuss was about. What was so special about some old barn that you'd bring down an entire organization to avenge it?" "This was never about revenge," I told her. "It was about justice, about restoring balance." She laughed bitterly. "You've destroyed my career. The investigation has frozen all my assets. I may face criminal charges, and you stand there talking about balance?" I gestured toward the gathering. "Look around. These people are building something together instead of being pitted against each other by arbitrary rules. That's the difference between what you were doing and what's happening now." "I was just doing my job," she said quietly. "So am I," I replied. "The difference is remembering who we're ultimately supposed to serve." She turned to leave, then paused. "Your grandfather, would he have gone this far?" The question caught me off guard with its unexpected insight. "No," I admitted, after a moment. "He would have focused on rebuilding, not pursuing everyone involved. He was better than me that way." Something shifted in her expression. Not forgiveness, but perhaps recognition. "Maybe when this is all over, you could tell me about him. Sometime, about why that barn mattered so much." She walked away before I could respond, disappearing down the road that divided our worlds. I rejoined the ceremony with a strange sense of incompletion. Victory, I was learning, rarely feels the way you expect. The barn rose again over the following months, its weathered beams interwoven with new timber, stronger than before. The historical center opened that fall, featuring exhibits on local agricultural history and sustainable building practices. Ironically, it became Evergreen Estates' most advertised community feature, drawing visitors and raising property values throughout the area. The legal consequences unfolded more slowly. The investigation expanded to similar developments across 3 states. Executives resigned. Class action lawsuits were filed, new regulations were implemented, systems changed because enough people finally said, enough. As for me, I kept my grandfather's rocking chair on the porch overlooking the rebuilt barn. Some evenings I sit there, watching the sunset paint its timbers gold, and reflect on what justice really means. Not retribution, but restoration. not winning at all costs, but rebuilding something better from the ruins. Karen was right about one thing. My grandfather wouldn't have taken the fight as far as I did. His focus would have remained on what was directly in front of him. In pursuing systemic change, I'd strayed from his example in ways both necessary and troubling. Justice without compassion risks becoming another form of power abuse. That realization has tempered every ruling I've made from the bench since. The barn stands as both monument and reminder of what was lost, of what was gained, of the fine line between justice and vengeance, and of my grandfather's most important lesson, one I nearly forgot in the heat of battle, that how we rebuild matters more than how we fight. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.